So I'm Dr. Lisa Miller. I've been a professor at Columbia University in New York for over 20 years. And at this time, I started the Spirituality Mind Body Institute with a very clear and heartfelt intention to put spirituality first. In our institute, we weave together science, personal spiritual growth and awareness, and service. And the way we implement these goals, this braid of science, growth, and service, is through sharing and conducting scientific studies using our lens of clinical science. Every form of method we can get our hands on, MRI studies, genotyping studies, epidemiological long-term clinical course, high risk, every method that we can grab, we use the lens to look at the nature of human spirituality through the lens of clinical science and how its strengthening is game-changing onto the rest of our lives, particularly focusing on mental health, wellness, and the positive character strengths and virtues. So I'm going to share the science with you as leaders, as professionals, as a lens of your own, so that in your own professional expertise, you have one more arrow in your quiver. You have both the ability to understand and see the spiritual core in your patients, in your clients, in your colleagues, in yourself. And through this lens of science, you have a very powerful tool. It enables you, as you may know well, science is a language that many institutions trust among the many forms of knowing. Science is a language many institutions elevate as grounds for institutional transformation. And it was based on this science that I was able to start the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia University, a secular institution in New York. It was through this science that the United States Pentagon, the military, was able to rule in the legal office that it is an absolute, in the United States, constitutional right. Spirituality is a form like physical life, mental life, cognitive. We are naturally born. We have an innate spiritual capacity. It is distinct from religion. And there are many ways that we can strengthen this innate spiritual capacity. In the United States, for 2/3 of people, the natural spiritual core is strengthened by religion. And for 1/3 of people, the natural spiritual core is strengthened by nature, art, music, family. Whether or not we are religious, we have a natural spiritual core. Or put another way, every human being on earth is born a spiritual being. Big claim. How does science prove that? Big claim. As you know, we often use a twin study. We look at twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out their degree of commonality as a function of shared environment or shared genes. Do they share 100% or half of their genes? Using a twin study, we know, for instance, that all of you professionals are very smart because you were born intelligent. IQ is 60% innate. You are a smart little baby. And now you're a smart grown-up, 40% cultivated, but you were born highly intelligent. Temperament, another human capacity, whether we are introverted or extroverted, whether we are tightly wound or laid back, our temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. So I am a parent. I have 3 children. The middle child, who likes our family to call her not the middle child, but the center child. The center child. The center child was born and woke up 4 times a night. It was her temperament for 1.5 years, 18 months. And you know the voice of a little baby who's anxious or in distress. I'd walk across the house, soothe the baby environment. That baby is now 20. She sleeps through the night. And she also has allowed me to share that she's a little bit anxious. Temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. The capacity through which we experience and perceive. So this is not a theory, this is not a theology, this is not a belief. The innate capacity through which we experience and perceive spiritual life is 1/3 innate. It is our birthright. And you will see that there is indeed a neurodocking station for this birthright. 1/3 innate, but 2/3 environmentally formed is a tremendous impact of our environment. In the first 2 decades, childhood, adolescence, the environment is largely shaped by our parents, pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, minister. 10,000 small social exchanges in high school that hold implicitly, who are we? What is our moral code? What is our walk on earth? There is high impact. And yet the 2/3 embrace does continue throughout our life because there are 3 bridges: emerging adulthood, midlife, and elderhood. At least 3 bridges through which we are hardwired to transform. And as you know, of people who work with those who suffer and those who are renewed, there are moments, life events, birth of a child. People will say, I believed in nothing, and then my child was born. And others say, as my mother grew ill and crossed over, I knew that there was a continuity of spirit, of consciousness after death. Chapter breaks, 3 bridges, and life events all weigh in to shape, to strengthen, to ignite, or without such support, left to lay fallow, the spiritual core atrophies. 2/3 is a very large component to shape the natural innate. Now, religion is 100% environmentally transmitted. Religion is a gift of our parents, grandparents. We may choose our community, a religious life, and locate ourselves in it. And the richness of the text, the ceremony, the beautiful prayers, community, the practices of transcendence are all magnificent ways that can be part of the rich 2/3 embrace, religion, onto the natural spiritual core. Religion itself is 100% environmentally transmitted. Now, let's use this basic science to look at a challenge, and then it's your own professional expertise. You may bring this lens, this roadmap of human spirituality onto many different challenges. Today, let's look at the pandemic that faces Gen Z, 18 through 25-year-olds, in the overwhelming majority of post-industrial global culture. Much of Europe, the United States and Canada, post-industrial global culture. Okay. What might you imagine is the number one killer, the number one source of death for 18 through 25-year-olds? It is not COVID. It is not cancer. It is no longer auto accidents. It is suicide. Exactly. I heard you. Yes, it is suicide. The rate of death by suicide has now surpassed the rate of death of auto accident and cancer, of the number one killer of youth. That is true in high school, and it presses down now to middle school. It's about the number 2 killer in middle school. So we know that in every home we can raise our child, our own way, but we send our child into our culture. And in the air and water of our culture, there's a pathogenic contaminant. Just like we have poison in our air and poison in our water, physically, environmentally, there's a poison in our culture. And it looks like this. Traditionally, we have located diagnosis in the individual. The young man, he has dual diagnosis, major depression and addiction. The young woman, she is at risk for suicide and has dysthymia and double depression. We have turned to the individual, but I will share that at least in the United States this year, half of Gen Z, 48%, reported at least a clinically moderate, which means painful and interfering level of a disease of despair. And so we can no longer locate only at the level of the individual. And we need to look at the tidal wave that is around them, consuming them, of a pathogenic culture. How did we get here? How is it that they are being swallowed up? Well, about 40 years ago, in many countries, we silenced the public square about religion. In the United States, we took all the Christmas trees down from the town hall, the local town hall. Right now, if you want to be a professor in Brussels, you have to sign a contract that you will not mention God. Okay, so yes, so it is now a situation where we have a generation of young people. Some have a strong spiritual core, but never have so many never had a 2/3 embrace. They have never had a parent or a grandparent to pray or meditate by their side, pray out loud for a dinner, tuck them into bed with a good night prayer. They have never read any sacred text, Quran, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, nothing. Or been part of a community that has as its foundation spiritual awareness. So we are facing something quite unprecedented in the past several hundred years, which is a generation that has a profoundly atrophied spiritual core. Now, why does that matter? Because if we look at the roadmap of developmental spirituality, we see that there is an opportunity before us to reverse the tidal wave, to get above the tidal wave that is pathogenic. Gen Z, exquisitely sensitive, very morally committed, animal rights, human rights, has yet to have a rich 2/3 embrace, but they are primed for our support. There is a growth spurt. It's marked from 15 to 18 to 22 years old, middle adolescence, late adolescence, emerging adulthood. There's a growth spurt. Just as we grow up physically, we are expanding spiritually. We identify this growth spurt in longitudinal twin studies taken over every 2 years from 15 to 24. There is an increase of 50% in the heritable contribution to spiritual perception. There is a surge, and with that, a hunger for love, connection, truth, a nagging of the head. What is my meaning and purpose? And I do not mean merely, am I going to be a teacher or a doctor or a minister? I mean ultimate purpose in relationship to life itself. Me as a soul on earth and my here I'm at the trailhead. I'm 19 years old. I'm at the trailhead of the long journey. What will be my ultimate walk, my contribution in a relationship to God, my higher power? If I am humanist, the gift of life. The teenager, the young adult, is exquisitely sensitive to you. You make a huge impact in the 2/3 embrace as he or she goes through this growth spurt, this developmental imperative of spiritual individuation, the me and not me of truth. Everything you told me, mom, dad, pastor, priest, imam, it's up for reflection and question against my own inner compass, spiritual individuation. When the spiritual core is formed, for some it is through a deepening of transcendent awareness. For some it is through questioning and connecting. When the spiritual core is formed, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against the diseases of despair. A 19, 20-year-old who is a standard deviation above as compared to a standard deviation below the mean in personal spiritual life. My personal spirituality is highly important to me. I turn it to God for guidance in times of difficulty and feel and know and hear and answer in my mind's eye. Nature is a sacred home where I am renewed and find direction and inspiration. Because the innate capacity has two threads: a capacity to be in a transcendent relationship. God, Hashem, Allah, Jesus, the universe, source, a transcendent relationship, and to feel that sacred presence in our love for one another. Relational spirituality to our higher power uses the same neurodocking station as relational spirituality, radical, unconditional love to our family, the homeless man, the person in need, our boss, our employee, radical, unconditional love. That is a form of love that is held at the level of transcendence and immanence, right? We published this study in JAMA Psychiatry in 2014. It was the first in a series of articles on the neural correlates of spiritual awareness, and more specifically, relational spirituality to God and God's presence in one another. And what we saw is that over 8 years in this longitudinal study, those people who consistently over 8 years said, yes, my personal spirituality is highly important to me, were shown to have a thicker cortex, strength, processing power across these very broad regions in red. As you're well aware, normally an MRI study shows a very little difference, significant, important, but small. This is a huge region, broad and pervasive regions represented in red of processing power, cortical thickening in people with sustained spiritual life. Now, what's most interesting is that those regions, the parietal, precuneus, and occipital, regions of perception, reflection, and orientation, are not thick, but thin instead in people with recurrent major depression. Thick with sustained spirituality, thin with recurrent major depression, with 85% overlap, offering some evidence that sustained spiritual life may be neuroprotective against major depression. Now, we sent this to JAMA. As you know, every article, every bit of science is peer reviewed by 2 or 3 scientists, 2 or 3 times, blind to the authors. So there's no cult of personality. Well, we got back the reviews, excellent, clear, very likely to be published, but we have one more question. What does thickening across the regions of what I now call the awakened brain, what does cortical thickness across the regions of the awakened brain say about us prospectively? How does our structure today affect our wellness, our mental health a year from now? So we ran that data and we found that cortical thickness across the awakened brain was protective 1 year from now against the level of depressive symptoms that we all hold. How much so? Well, for most people, when we went to look at a full-out diagnosis of MDD, we found that a thick cortex is 75% protective against MDD. But if we are at high risk, genetic high risk, maybe I'm under the rain cloud of a depressogenic family way of being, it is always us who are the losers. It is always us who fail. The depressogenic family, I am at risk. Genes, cognitive style, culture, stress. In that case, I am 90% protected. We are under rain and hail of emotional life, the more spirituality is protective. Now, we don't get a red brain easily because these folks who developed a strong personal spirituality, 2/3 embrace was part of their work. I'll put it this way, if you think of a longitudinal timeline, those people who at mean age 26-year-olds said, yes, my personal spiritual life is highly important to me, were 2.5 times 250% more likely to have gotten there over the past 10 years through suffering. Strong spirituality today means that over the past 10 years, I am 2.5 times more likely to have suffered with MDD. Yet once the spiritual core is formed, I am 75% or 90 if under risk against recurrence. So this says that the relationship between spirituality and depression has a lovely, intricate life course to it, that it is through struggle that we strengthen the spiritual core. There is a developmental depression at the three bridges and at the life events very often. The developmental depression is the knock at the door for spiritual emergence. It is the ignition of rising to expanding to our next phase of spiritual awareness. I am 100% for medication if people are in pain, but medication alone is not enough to support developmental depression that leads to spiritual awakening. There must also be a mining, a reaching into what is life showing me now? What in my deep inner wisdom do I feel? Am I loved? In the way that you see in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, am I loved and held? Am I guided? Am I never alone? The neuro docking station to explore relational spirituality. The yellow circle is our birthright. This is its neuro docking station. And how we move from developmental depression to spiritual awakening, whether it is through reflection, whether it is through walking by the side of our clients in psychotherapy and counseling, a spiritual walk, prayer, meditation, right action, nature often entrains the brain, much as prayer. These are the opportunities of our clients' lifetime. And they do not get it anywhere else, at least 2/3 of the time. So we asked young people, we asked 18 to 25-year-olds, come into our lab and tell us about a time that you were stressed and about a time where you felt deep relational spirituality. The first finding was in the first minute where the adolescent said, wow, I've had experiences like that. I always thought something was going on, but no one ever asked. That was our first finding, no 2/3 embrace. The second finding was that whether I am Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, spiritual, but not religious, nature is my cathedral. The same neural correlates ran in an fMRI study. The same neural correlates. There's one spiritual brain, one awakened brain, and we all have it. Now, of course, we can strengthen the awakened brain, and there's natural human variation in its components, but there is one spiritual brain. It is who we are. And what are its circuits? What did we see? We see that in every single person, there is an awareness that we are loved and held, guided, and never alone. Loved and held, guided, and never alone. What does that look like? What does that sound like? Well, this very same young person, we can ask him or her, tell us about a time. And they say, I am so depressed. I'm so frustrated. I have just been turned down at 7 out of 9 medical schools. I will never be a doctor like my mother and father. But then I'm walking down the sidewalk. I see light in the leaves. And I know God has a plan for me. And I will be a healer in the way I am intended. Or my boyfriend and I, we went out, boyfriend, girlfriend, for 3 years of university. He gave me a promise ring. We were going to get married. And the week before graduation, he called it off. It broke my heart. I felt so unlovable. And I fear I will never, ever love again. I feel unworthy. I feel ugly. But then sitting in the pews of my house of worship by my parents and grandparents, I felt this great love of my family. And then I felt God's love. And I knew, yes, I will love again. There is a deep reordering, a deep reshuffling of meaning. This is not driven by belief. It is a deep perceptual shift through which we realize we are loved and held, guided, and never alone. The neural correlates in the fMRI, loved and held, the bonding network, just as we're loved and held as children in our parents' arms. Guided, we move from top down dorsal to bottom up ventral attention. The lights go back on in life, and many people say a new direction pops. Loved and held, guided, and never alone. The parietal, which puts in and out hard boundaries. We are a point and we are a wave. We are distinct and magnificently diverse in a different zipped up bio bodysuit and different GPS coordinates. And we are part of one consciousness, one spirit, white caps on one ocean. I could be all alone in my COVID apartment. I could feel totally cut off from people. And yet through the parietal, I am able to perceive I am always part of the family of life, always part of the field of life, loved, held, guided, and never alone. Same neural correlates, whether it's told through the church, the temple, the mosque, or the forest, or the mountaintop. This is our birthright. This is our birthright. Okay, so may I invite us, having talked about the awakened brain and its centrality in protection against addiction, depression, risk-taking, and even suicide. In fact, in a meta-analysis, a study of studies, 2,000 tragically completed suicides, 5,000 matched controls, the meta-analysis showed a 62% decreased relative risk of suicide, and that went up to 82% when spiritual life is shared with my therapist, shared in a group, a counseling group, shared in fellowship, Minyan, Sangha. I work with the Army, shared in the squad. I work with businesses, shared in the office, in a way that is inclusive, pluralistic, and in the US constitutional. Everyone speaks from their own spiritual core. So what does that sound like? Well, in the Army, it sounds like this. Basic training has been revised to support the spiritual core. Sir, how is your spiritual core? Sir, my spiritual core hurts. Sir, would you like to see the universal chaplain? We had a hard day out there today. Our squad of 8, let's go around and tell me from your spiritual core. And one says, I felt God was with me and I knew we were protected. The next says, my grandmother, she walks with me. This was taken into the Army as a beautiful collaboration between the Pentagon, the Chief of Chaplains, the Surgeon General of the Army, and the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia. In my class at Columbia, the original method was to go in a circle and each person speak from their own spiritual heart about their ultimate understanding, spiritual multilingualism. And the first person says, sharing the red brain, everyone in the circle. For me, when I got my period, my grandma tattooed me and it linked me to my mother and my mother's mother, all the matrilineal. And the next student says, yes, I understand that because my grandma was there when I came home from school. She gave me a snack. She taught me to pray. She would listen to me. And so now when I think of God, it's kind of God and my grandma all rolled up into one. And the next person says, yeah, I understand that. My grandma, she's passed, but I feel her walk by my side. And when my back is against the wall, when I'm in danger, I feel her. I can hear her in my mind's eye. And finally, the last person says, I don't know about my own family faith tradition. It's never felt right, but I know that energy can never be destroyed. So yeah, that's your grandma. Spiritual multilingual is not just a friendly nod of acceptance. It is a deep engagement, the spiritual core of the whole person. I want to know you. It is a much deeper embrace. We have inclusivity efforts around race and gender and orientation. Spiritual inclusivity starts from the core. And we are not just respectful of difference. We are not just a point. We are also a wave. We are able to embrace in a loving connection through the unique walk. These are ways that the spiritual core has been engaged. So I'd like to share with you now a practice, if I could. I'm going to invite you to, if you'd like, always an invitation, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and clear out your inner space. 5 breaths. I invite you to set before you a table. This is your table in your inner chamber. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything you may have done or not done, anything you may have or not have, your true, eternal, higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, whatever your word is, your higher power, and ask them if they love you. And now, with all of these people sitting here right now, what do they need to share? What do they need to tell you now? What do you need to know? And when you're ready, I invite you back. This is your counsel, and they are always there for you. Who shows up at the table may change depending on where you are in your journey, and you may ask them what is on your mind. This is your birthright. This is your inborn birthright, your awakened brain. I will share with you that on a trip to Germany about 8 months ago, I visited an inpatient unit and shared this practice. And the young man, probably about 24, next to me, turned to me and he said, "I find that to be very reassuring." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I wasn't so sure about what was religion and what was spirituality, and I have been traumatized. And this tells me that no one can ever take that away." He felt experientially in the here and now his own transcendent connection, own relationality, and knew that no one can take it away. Very often people get confused between a bad messenger of religion, someone who did not walk the walk. They were a torchbearer, the light, the truth, the way. We do not make the fire, we carry it. But they did not walk the walk, whether it was a pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, a trusted teacher, parent, uncle. And when the messenger does not walk the walk, a young person will throw out the flame very often. With trauma is moral injury. And with trauma and moral injury, more fundamentally, is spiritual injury. There was a time in my life where I felt closer to God. It was easier to pray, or even traumatized people may say, I feel unworthy before God for what I did. That is a chilly, chilly place to be. Right? But what we've seen is that trauma is actually a gateway to spiritual awakening, much like developmental depression. This is a study of 3,000 plus vets. Every single person here has been in a war. Every single person here meets criteria for PTSD. What varies along the x-axis is their level of symptom. So as we go out, more and more and more and more higher levels of trauma, sleeplessness, reactivity, anxiety. Up the y-axis are units of growth. More trauma, more growth. More trauma, more growth. More trauma, more growth, until we're so far out the curve we need support to grow. This inverted umbrella, this inverted U-shaped curve, shows that for more we suffer, the more we grow. So much so is that the case that on the other side, we may feel a form of growth, post-traumatic growth, that changes. It is a deeper shuffling of how we see the world. This is a study by Tsai. It is referenced in The Awakened Brain, TSAI, Tsai and colleagues. Tedeschi and colleagues asked, how do we get up on the curve? What helps support post-traumatic growth? And there were 4 factors: access to the experience, putting it into words, sharing the experience in a group. Those 3 are very familiar through cognitive behavioral therapy, starting in the 80s with Edna Foda. But the 4th is foundationally different, which is shining the light of spiritual awareness onto the very memory. Where was God? Where is your higher power? What is the deeper force or source? And then I saw a deeper shuffling of meaning, that I could be forgiven. And then I knew God had been with me all the time. And then suddenly I realized we both were not to blame. There is a profound reshuffling of meaning, post-traumatic spiritual growth. Post-traumatic spiritual growth. I might, through this process, feel closer to God, a reversal of spiritual injury. I might feel a greater love for those around me, able to look with no more shame into the eyes of my children or partner. Post-traumatic spiritual growth strengthens the spiritual core, the life event. Now, I'll tell you where I always like to thank my teacher, Dr. Gary Weaver, who has now passed. The late Dr. Gary Weaver gave me, and I give you, pass forward, this visualization, the spiritual visualization of hosting counsel. Dr. Gary Weaver, I met one day. I was speaking in Salt Lake City, Utah, in a large auditorium. And in the very back row was a man who had so much love that I couldn't take my eyes off him. I'm talking about the numbers, I'm sharing the story, and I'm just feeling this great love at the other end of the auditorium. And then I see right next to this shining, radiant, loving elder man is an equally shining, radiant, loving wife. They both glow, and I can feel it. So the second I'm finished with my talk, I walk through the aisle. I go up to the couple, the loving couple, and I say, who are you? And it turns out that Dr. Gary Weaver worked for 38 years with teenage boys who were from the courts, court referred. They had 3 times broken the law, and on the 3rd time went before the judge of juvenile court. And no one liked these boys because they had been abused and most of them had become abusers. And the judge would say, you have a choice. You can go to prison with adults now, third time, or you can go out into the desert, the Moab desert of Utah with Dr. Gary Weaver. And given that choice, the boys would go with Dr. Weaver. Two things happened, and they both pertain to relational spirituality. The first is that the boys faced great challenges in the arid desert. There was not enough water. They had to share. There were precipices that you could only climb if you worked together. And no one ate dinner until the last boy crosses the line. They formed a we. They formed an unconditional, both feet in we, relational spirituality. And the second thing they did was that Dr. Weaver shared that very spiritual visualization so that the boys could start to connect directly. The boys could start to connect directly to the flame. They could realize their own birthright for relational, awakened spirituality. And no longer was it held, no longer was it foreclosed, no longer was it damaged or traumatized by a bad messenger. Because in the formation of the spiritual core, there is an equal contribution. It is not by picking up a book at 15 or 17 or 19. It is not by one trip across the world, but rather it is by the equal contribution of our mentors, our parents, our clergy, our counselors, walking the walk and talking the walk. Walking the walk is unconditional love, the formation of the we. Walking the walk of spiritual values, patience, unconditional love, charity, mercy, care. Talking the walk, praying out loud, using words to describe the map of spiritual life, giving our own stories. And the boys were healed, so much so that when Dr. Weaver died, when Dr. Weaver passed, I attended his funeral. Now, I had required of my graduate students that if they wanted to work with me, they had to go out into the desert with Dr. Weaver, and they had. And they were so moved that all of the graduate students came with me to Utah. And sitting there in a very small church, 2 hours into the desert from Salt Lake, were hundreds and hundreds of people. And the first 3 rows were pallbearers, 28 men. And why were these the 28 men to be the pallbearers for Dr. Weaver, the loving man? Because he had adopted 28 sons. He expanded my view of what so-called professional boundaries were. He expanded my view of who we could be to one another. And in general, his program had an 85% success rate. Abused boys who were abusers, third time before the judge, had an 85% success rate when working from the spiritual core. And his 28 sons had become teachers and forest rangers and fathers, people of contribution. This is who we are. And our darkest hour is built, hardwired to be an opportunity, a knock at the door for spiritual awakening. I thought we might pause now and maybe have discussion, and then we can go back and do part 2 of the science. Should I do a recap? We are now.
This is just incredible. Thank you so much. We have a most like
Any questions?
Any questions? Yeah, tomorrow. Here. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Miller. I read your paper because I'm my professor is working on spiritual dryness, and I read your studies because of the cortical thicknesses that people have that are religious and praying having spiritual rituals. But instead, or indeed, there are some brothers and sisters of some kind of religious order. They still have something that is called spiritual dryness. How would you, which is not easy to differentiate from MDD. So what would you think would this kind of spiritual dryness be from your point of science? If we talk about, because they have these rituals, they do every day praying and all that kind of stuff, and still they have this dark night of the soul, you know what I mean? So this, can you maybe coordinate or hear some kind of view, your point of view on these kind of things? You have an idea for that?
Thank you. And I just want to make sure that in this conversation, we're clarifying the difference between when I hear dryness, was there never any rich formation? Was there not a strong spiritual core? Was the natural capacity not formed through which we feel a transcendent relationship to God,
so I think in
one another?
I think in this case, you're speaking about people who had a spiritual connection,
Yes.
and who were maybe even clergy and priests,
Yes.
and who developed a secondary spiritual dryness.
Oh, beautiful. Yes. Thank you for asking. So we look at long-term clinical course studies together with Myrna Weissman, who followed 3 generations, grandparents, G1, now the adult children, G2, and then generation 3 are the teenage children, over 40 years. And what we saw was, as I shared with you, they're the first bridge of emerging adulthood. Late adolescence, emerging adulthood was a developmental depression with the natural booting up, the expansion of spiritual capacity, which we know to be true in every tradition. Bar and bat mitzvah, the sweat lodge, the anipi in indigenous traditions, confirmation in many Christian traditions. With coming of age physically, there's understood to be an expansion that boots up in emerging adulthood as often a half-empty glass of spirituality, existential developmental depression. We see this again at midlife. And in fact, what we saw, just like Carl Jung speaks of, in fact, what we saw was that at midlife, late 40s, mid to mid 50s, the people who had had a very high level of spirituality and who had been protected between 26 and 52, right? Suddenly, the more spiritual they are, the more they seem to have a midlife developmental depression. And it has a similar sound in emerging adulthood. What is my meaning? What is God's purpose for me? What is as a soul on earth, what is my meaning and direction at midlife? How have I lived out? Truly, have I walked the walk of my ultimate purpose? What kind of parent have I been? What is my spiritual footprint on earth? This is a profound experience. Now, very often in post-industrial Western culture, we have nicknames. This is sophomore slump. Over here, midlife crisis. Neither name gives justice to the profound developmental imperative and the opportunity of a lifetime. Because with expanded spiritual capacity, there is an existential yearning. It feels like a half-empty glass once again, so that we might rise to the next station of our life, the second half of life. Jung talked about this as turning from outward to inward. And I share, having had this process, I share with my colleagues who may have had this process, this often, and I see this in so many people, there seems to me no difference when you look at humans, when we think of consciousness or spirit as independent of matter. There is no difference. We see this in synchronicity, mystical experience. There's no difference between the so-called perception of the inside versus the unfolding event of the outside. And I find at midlife, the biggest ego threat arrives. And it's a challenge. If I'm afraid of ever losing my money, I lose my money. If I'm afraid of infidelity, there's infidelity. If I'm afraid of unemployment, I'm fired. There's some sort of opportunity of a lifetime for ego death. And it is, of course, a time of existential searching. When this is supported, we can think, who do we want to be now as we cross the bridge to care for our younger, 20s, 30s, 40s children, the earth? Who do we want to be? What is a deeper love? What does our inner wisdom know through our walk? This is a time of profound formation. I'm not against drugs, but drugs alone are not enough. When I have given this data to groups of clergy, what I hear is, yep, that's me. People who've had a deep spiritual path have a deeper suffering. In science, we have seen that our spiritual strength exists whether we are introverts or extroverts, whether we're tightly wound or laid back. That personality, particularly as measured by the big 5 personality traits, are independent of our spiritual capacity, except for one form of personality that is actually more perceptual: openness to experience. And it turns out that people who are open to experience are healers, our clergy, our poets and musicians, often more sensitive, more porous, profoundly receptive, perceptive. We'll have a greater spiritual awareness, transcendent relationality, and whether it's the universe or God and every one of us and fellow living beings, and a bigger developmental depression, both at midlife and back during formation, emergence. Okay. So again, there's a very beautiful, intricate wave where, to some extent, spirituality and depression are 2 sides of one door over and over again in our lives. Post-traumatic spiritual growth. We are built to be more, not less. That is accelerated when there's a lot of trauma. My colleague, who's the chief of chaplains, the 2-star general Soljum in the U.S. Army, sits with soldiers every day who say, "Sir, there is no place in God's heaven for a man like me." And Chaplain Soljum says, "What do you mean?" And true to protocol, this young man is stationed in the Middle East. He's in special operations. He's the number 2 man in line. The first man goes in the door of a war-filled situation. The first man is shot. This man walks in, second man, and he shoots those people who shot his fellow soldier. He looks up. There's a 40-year-old, there's an elder, and there's a 13-year-old boy who were shooting him, and he killed a 13-year-old boy. At home, he has a 13-year-old boy. There's a 13-year-old boy. At home, he has a 13-year-old boy. He comes back from the Middle East. He cannot look his own boy in the eye. Post-traumatic spiritual injury. "Sir, there is no place in God's heaven for someone like me." That is a spiritual injury, and that is the depth and level at which there needs to be work. Access to the experience, putting it in words, sharing it in a group, and shining God's presence into that moment through our deeper form of knowing. The Army has now used this science to create treatment teams that have both a psychiatrist, a behavioral health specialist, and a universally trained chaplain. It's post-traumatic spiritual growth. That is a foundationally spiritual process. The frame is a spiritual frame. So we have 2 forms of knowing. We have awakened knowing, which is an open system, and we have achieving knowing, which is a closed system, and our brain can do both. Achieving awareness we come by very honestly in our post-industrial Western schools. What is the strategy? What is the tactic? How do you know what you know in this science problem? Why did you ask that question? Everything is referenced. It is a historically driven way of knowing, everything from today backwards. And we have so strengthened our achieving awareness that it actually starts to live in the air and water. And I find it to be a great force pushing the tidal wave because it is overextended. There are times in life where achieving awareness is not enough. We also have awakened awareness. Awakened awareness is an open system where we go from what do I want and how am I going to get it? why didn't it work? I wanted that job. Why didn't it work? To, wow, what is life showing me now? What is the universe asking of me now? What am I to become? It is an open system that draws on multiple forms of knowing. Inside of us is a logician and an empiricist, and equally an intuitive and a mystic and a skeptic, all organic forms of knowing, inborn epistemologies. And when we use multiple forms of knowing, we connect regions of the brain. We see this through DTI, diffusion tensor imaging. When you look at a brain, you can track the amount of water that flows along a neuron versus leaking out the neuron. And when there's more myelination, there's a higher ratio of water moving along the neuron. There is more interconnection between regions of the brain when we use multiple forms of knowing. So I'm going to invite you now into a second practice, if I may. It's about just as long, about 2 minutes. If you'd like, I invite you to close your eyes, take a breath, 5 breaths. I invite you to locate a time when you did everything right. There was something you wanted. It could have been a job, an internship. You may have wanted to get into a graduate school, a medical school, or him or her or them to say yes. And you did everything right. Research, strategy, A plus B plus C, that red door was yours. And you did it right, A plus B plus C. You went to take your 99% red door, grab the handle, but it's stuck. And you can't believe it's stuck because you did everything right, A plus B plus C. And you kick the door, you're surprised, maybe angry, in time perhaps depressed because you had wanted it so much. But only because that red door was stuck, you had no choice. You turned 30, 80, 110 degrees you turned, and there was a wide open yellow door. You might have said yellow doors don't exist. You hadn't heard of yellow doors. You crossed the yellow door, and on the other side is a landscape that is not what you had wanted. It was better and better for you than what you had envisioned. You met a partner who made you feel alive. You found work that felt so meaningful you couldn't wait to get out of bed. You met a mentor at the other university who actually allowed you to find your professional path. Now, as you think of that stuck red door and the hairpin turn leading to the wide open yellow door, the shiny yellow door that has everything to do with who you are and where you are today. At that hairpin turn, was there anyone pointing the way who gave you information, told you their own story? It could have been someone you met for 3 minutes at the coffee shop. It could have been a dear friend or grandparent who, for the first time, shared a story to reveal their hairpin turn. There was a counselor, a therapist, a minister, a clergy, a trail angel pointing to the yellow door. And as you think now of the stuck red door, the hairpin turn, the trail angel, and the wide open yellow door that has so much to do with who you are and where you are today, how are the most important parts of our lives formed? Is it narrowly, is it exclusively through planning and strategy and hard work? Yes, that's important. But is that alone sufficient to find the yellow doors? Are we less hardcore makers of our path and far more discoverers of our journey and adventure? And as you sit way back and look at your road of life, where in your journey is your higher power, who I call God, your higher power? Is your higher power the source of our lives, in us, through us, among us? Where in the open yellow door and the stuck red door? Is your higher power in the trail angel and your ability to be open and receive and perceive as an open system, this great force of life, loving, holding, guiding, never to leave us alone? And I invite you to think of 3 more legs of your journey that have had hairpin turns, yellow doors, and invite you into the possibility that when we are in dialogue with this great force in us, through us, and around us, we are open to what we might call synchronicity, alignments, messengers far too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance, but as making enormous sense when we are tuned to this great sacred force, the gifts of the journey on the spiritual path. And when you're ready, I invite you back. And I welcome for your reflection, is life perhaps a balance between achieving and awakened awareness, between strategy, historically based information, everything I want is based on today back, and an awakened, open system form of perception, trail angels and yellow doors that are a catch in the catcher's mitt, an intuitive or mystical or synchronistic catch, the information in which is yet to unfold over time. Are we whitecaps on one ocean? When we live this way, here are DTI findings. We have more highly interconnected brains. This is a good brain, more creative, more situationally aware, more innovative in our work, and more importantly, in our path, in our life. Now, when we live this way, not only does our brain start to look like a red brain, thick, strong, capable in regions of perception, reflection, and orientation, neuroprotective against depression, able to see that we're loved, held, guided, and never alone, able to ask a question of the head and get an answer of the heart, so to speak, inquire logically, test empirically, and receive an intuitive hit of what it really means, or a mystical guidance, as I share in one of my books. The answer to 2 years of data appeared on the subway, right? It was a synchronicity on the subway to work. Our brains also function differently when we look at the energy that we move, not only structurally to perceive the world differently, but we use our brains differently as measured by EEG, the wavelength off the back of our head. We found that much like a meditating monk, people who, through a deep spiritual process, go through despair, depression, dark night of the soul, and come out the other side with greater spiritual awakening, give off high amplitude alpha, where many traditions cover our head. Now, high amplitude alpha is also given off if you take that same depressed, struggling person and give them SSRIs, give them Prozac. So the same wavelength that is found by giving a depressed person Prozac is the same wavelength found by allowing a depressed person to dig and open and have a spiritual awakening and expansion. The problem is that when we take away the SSRIs, we lose alpha. But when we walk the developmental road and find our yellow doors and learn to hear trail angels and develop a relationship to the force, the loving guiding force in us, through us, and among us, we walk a different walk. We're literally walking in a different way, space, seat of perception. And I would argue on a different plane of being. It's high amplitude alpha. Not only is it the wavelength given off a meditating monk and those to recover from depression from SSRI, but when we recover from depression through spiritual awakening, alpha, high amplitude alpha is the same wavelength that goes by another name in another field, Schumann's resonance. The constituent wavelength from the Earth's crust up 1 mile all the way around the Earth. when the spiritually engaged brain vibrates at the same wavelength as all life, as creation, as what I would call the garden. We are with everyone else. So if you ask this scientist, what is Eden? What is the Garden of Eden? It is the place we share and that we inhabit. The spiritually engaged brain inhabits when we are in deep, sacred relationality, when we are loved, guided, and held, and when we show up to be loving, guiding, and holding of those around us. What is dominion? Is it to dominate, or is dominion domicile, to make a home and use our supersized brain to care for everybody else? The spiritually engaged brain vibrates at the same wavelength as nature. We return to our nature. We feel a oneness of nature, which is reflected in the oneness of the wavelength. This is all referenced in the back of the awakened brain, which I'm so grateful to give to you again as a roadmap of who we are, as an arrow in your quiver, a lens for understanding your clients and their process and points of intervention, emerging spirituality in adulthood at midlife, and as a method for institutional change. You're naturally spiritual beings, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. And when we strengthen as counselors, therapists in deep moments of darkness and occlusion where we can't even see our hand, we know that is the birth of a new awakening. Okay, I'll take one more pause, and then we'll go on to talk about the upside, the positive strengths and virtues that come from the red brain. Shall we visit? Or questions? How did you experience the practices?
Thank you. Are there any questions? I experienced the practice as absolutely beautiful. I really had goosebumps at experiencing this red door and this yellow door. Bettina.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Come over here if you want.
Thank you very much for your speech and such a lot of very important information for us. Even if we are very much busy in this field, you brought us a lot of new information, and scientific information is very important. Thank you very much. One question I have.
Please.
We are busy with the very important, you have related a lot of changing into the biographic development, like midlife crisis. It was very important, you said. But we have been busy with another period of life, the middle childhood. And my question is, did you see any important aspect in relation to religion or spirituality in this childhood time around the middle of childhood? Because there are some people saying this is the important switching point of human development. How far you can see that there's a relationship to a certain kind of spirituality?
Can you please give me an age range when you say middle?
Yes, I can give you an age range between 6 and 12.
Ah, okay.
So we're looking at the transition middle childhood around the age of 9, range 6 and 12.
Beautiful. If I might, I'm going to pull up another group of slides I'd like you to see, okay? If I might, and it's here. I wrote a book in 2015 called The Spiritual Child. And this book has a lot of data around the first 2 decades of life in particular. The awakened brain is a paradigm of the full human lifespan and of developmental depression that we are hardwired through suffering to strengthen and emerge and have an awakening, a spiritual awakening. This book talks about the naturally spiritual child, what the child brings, because 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed means the child is a knower. The child, of course, is not a blank slate. And so I wanted to just move over here to the first decade, which you just asked about. What are the natural spiritual capacities in terms of the child's experience, in terms of what we can hear as therapists and parents and grandparents? What are the constituent capacities in the naturally spiritual child? And this research, it's much easier to do research on someone who is a teenager, can fill out questionnaires, or 18 and can be put in an MRI. This work is done very much through observation, parent journals, sometimes interview of the child, but in aggregate, and it's referenced in The Spiritual Child from 2015, a child is born with a spiritual compass. A child knows what truly is right and truly is wrong. But the 2/3 embrace is to fortify, to listen, to hear, to trust that deep inner intuitive compass, the natural knowing. And I will share with you an example. I told you I have 3 children. When my son was very, very young, he was the oldest child. He had Thomas the train. You may remember the trains, blue train, green trains, Thomas, Percy, Big City Engine, James, all these trains. And he was very, very excited to hear the news that a new baby was coming. That was called the new baby. He'd point to my stomach and he'd say, new baby. Well, the new baby came. And he was so excited. We put the baby down and he bestowed at her feet a loaf of bread from the kitchen. And then he put at her feet Thomas, his most treasured treasure. And we said, oh, Isaiah, look how you love the new baby. And then about 20 minutes went by. He picked up Thomas and dangled Thomas over the baby's head and said, Mama. Right? Now, Mama, he knew his inner compass was that you don't drop Thomas the train on the new baby. He knew that. Mama. Right? And he knows. And he's asking reinforcement. Listen to my compass. Hard stop on knowing. And he drops Thomas on the baby. Okay. Isaiah, you knew about the gentle, fragile baby. Isaiah, what are we going to do? Oh no, Thomas is on the baby. So, and he got very upset. Thomas was on the baby. He knew it was wrong. The child knows. And similarly, the child will often know things that we don't know. The child has, unless socialized out of it, unless taught a different map of reality, a child will perceive continuity of consciousness or spirit after death. They assume that, they see that, unless we tell them otherwise. So I'll give you an example. When Pop, great-grandpa of Isaiah, died, in the Jewish tradition, you go right to the side of the grave to pray and mourn, and then the family puts earth upon the casket. Right at the graveside, we take a shovel, we put earth on the casket to get through our body, mind, and soul that, yes, this person has passed, has crossed over. Well, it came to Isaiah sitting by my side, and he was handed a tiny garden shovel, a little spade, and he took earth and he put it on Pop. And he looked at me and his eyes were sparkling. And he said, look, Mama, the body goes back to the good earth and the soul goes to God. Those were his words. He was about 2.5. A week later, we were outside in the garden. Mama, says Isaiah, you come here now. And I come. Look, Mama, a dead turkey on our lawn. You see, and same sparkle. The body goes back to the good earth. The soul goes to God. That was a process of spiritual clarification, discovery. Those were not my words. He knew that. Similarly, unless socialized out of it, this is called implicit spiritual cognition. That was the term given by psychology. A clergy might say it, the natural knowing of the soul. The implicit spiritual cognition often in young children holds quite naturally that we can know things without having seen them through our senses, 5 senses, 5 material senses. We can know things without having been told them. So before a birthday party, a child will say, there'll be an alligator there. And sure enough, there's an alligator there. Or the child will say, Aunt Franny's calling. She's very beautiful. And Aunt Franny, I share this in the book, is dear Aunt Frances, who passed, who was very beautiful. But the child never was told this. Children are in deep relationship to living beings. So when we go to the park, when Isaiah was only really very young, 18 months, 1.5 years, we saw little yellow fluffy geese at the town park. And they were so cute. They looked like they were his age. They were sort of peers. And sure enough, naturally, Isaiah goes over and wants to play with the young baby geese. And he's very, very friendly, which is terrifying to Mother Goose. So Mother Goose, protecting her children, turns and makes a big hiss. When Mother Goose turned, she turned away from Isaiah to hiss at me. Why? She was in relationship. I was a mother. She was a mother. And I broke the universal code of protecting her children while watching my own. The hiss was at me. You're not doing your job as a mother to watch your child to the protection of mine. Everybody's in relationship. Unless socialized out of it, the young child will perceive that relationship of play, of like a classroom of children. But if we say, oh, the little geese are coming over, they must want your breadcrumbs. That's a statement that everything's transactional. Everything is breadcrumbs. That's a market-based notion. Breadcrumbs, that's an instrumental relationship. So a public square in the air and water minus a spiritual core, remember 40 years ago, 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a child who's at our door. We have raised children to say they want your breadcrumbs. A public square without a spiritual core is radically transactional. When I go to a dinner party, I'm asked, what do you do? Where do you live? What does your partner do? It is highly transactional. I would rather be asked, what was the most beautiful day of your summer? Can you tell me about when your kids were born? What happened in your house? I would like to talk about the deeper, truer nature of life, which is not transactional, but transformational. 2 more examples. Children comfortably pray. They love prayer. They love meditation. They love ceremony. Children will love to go up to the front of a house of worship and sing and touch the holy text. And finally, children are very much at home with mystical experiences. And when a child spontaneously shares a transcendent experience as a counselor, as a parent, we can honor that and say, wow, can you tell me more? I don't need to be an expert. I don't need to be a theological trained expert to honor. Wow, I bet that might really unfold over time to show meaning and significance in your life. Wow, it's real. We talk about it here. And it is the depth to which our relationship will go. It's real. That means that felt sense that something is indeed ontologically real, and you can lock it in, know it, and relocate it. It's real. We talk about it here. It is not forbidden. It is actually part of life, and we want to explore it and honor your spiritual experience. It is real. We talk about it here. We give them a language, a map, to build these capacities. We give them practices to build these capacities. Pray by their side, meditate by their side. A language, we say all day long, tow truck, orange, banana. We also can say, look, the sunset. I look at you. I know humans alone cannot build a child. There's a great force. God built you. Jesus built you. Spirit built you. You are sacred. You are like a ray of sun from the great sun. So these are ways language, practice, transparency of our own life. My mother was a very, very spiritual and religious woman. She would pray out loud and cry, and I could see the reality of spiritual truth in her feeling, in her prayer. We are the messengers. We are the ambassadors, walking the walk and openly talking the walk. Who we are, and we are teaching to our being, always. The clock runs. My father was very quiet, an academic who would read plays on the back porch, always very questioning. We don't really know what happens It's a very curious question, what happens after death. But when his own mother died, I always woke up at about 4 or 5 and I came downstairs. I was 9 years old. And for the first time, I saw my big, tall father in a little ball in the living room, sitting on the floor. So I sat down next to him. And he said, Grandma, who had just died within 24 hours, Grandma was in my dream. Grandma was in my dream last night. And he's searching, open, transparent in his own deep experience. He doesn't know what it means. He's working on it. And Grandma and I, Grandma always loved to dress up in pretty clothes and beautiful jewelry. But in this dream, Grandma is in a plain, everyday gray suit, my father tells me. And there we were walking, Grandma and I, side by side, down Grand Avenue, as we had walked so many times side by side. And he's searching in his childhood city. And he says, I take this to mean that Grandma had always been my mother, and she would continue to walk by my side as my mother. So I'm 56. I was 9. And that's the story I remember more than any of my father. We talk about that here. It has a language that speaks to a landscape of spiritual reality. And that is the depth to which our relationship goes. Now, my father, he never asked me if I won a race. He never asked me what my grades were. But he shared that. So that is who we are as torchbearers. I'll give one more story about childhood, because I started to tell you about synchronicity and direction. I had spent months and months looking at data on the intergenerational, the passing of the torch from grandparent to parent to child of spiritual life. And I looked at the torch, and when the grandmother held the torch, it was protective. And when the grandchild held the torch, it was protective. But I knew there was more in there. So this, I was at the time, this was one of my first studies on spiritual life. And it was BC, before children. So I was going up to Columbia on the weekend. It was a Sunday. And I'm running into the train station. I go down the subway to wait for the subway. And the first subway rolls by and it doesn't stop. And New York in the summer is very hot. If you go down into the subway, it's almost unbreathable. So it would have been nice if the train stopped, but another train's coming. I think, oh, good, here comes another. And it also goes right by. So it's a New York subway story. And finally, the third subway comes, and it comes in and it stops, but it's packed. Everyone's squeezed together. Hot day, August, all the people on the hot New York subway, except for one car. One car is wide open. And I'm feeling very clever. I jump onto the empty car, and quickly I see why. All of the passengers are at the far, far end, squeezed together. And half the car is empty, as there's a very frustrated, outspoken homeless man. As each person steps onto the subway, hey, you, will you sit with me? And they run down to the far side. Hey, you, are you going to sit with me? You going to be the one to sit with me? And they run down to the other end of the subway car. This 85th Street, 96th Street, 103rd Street. Hey, you want some of my lunch? And he starts throwing his lunch around the subway. You want some lunch? We get to 145. We go all the way to 145. The door opens, and on walks a beautiful, regal couple. It is a grandmother and her little granddaughter. Both of them are wearing white gloves, and the grandma has a pillbox hat. Grandma is in a beautiful green pastel, a soft spring summer green, and the little granddaughter's in a soft pink pastel, spring summer pastel. And the whole subway car looks at the royal couple and thinks, oh no, They're so lovely. Please, no. And sure enough, hey, you two, are you going to sit with me? Grandmother and granddaughter look at each other, nod, not a word, nod, and they walk right over to the homeless man and sit right by his side, touching shoulder to shoulder. And he's shocked. And he can't believe that someone has seen him. He can't believe that someone would sit with him alongside in fellowship. So he tests it. He's like, you want some of my lunch? Same thing. They look at each other, nod, and in unison, no, thank you. You want some of this? No, thank you. And they ride on and on and on. And the whole subway car is looking at this sight. I realize it's the weekend. They look so beautiful. It's Sunday morning. Grandma and granddaughter are going to church on Sunday morning. And then to my mind, I think, what you do to the least of these, you do to me. I think about the sacred relational spirituality. As we do to one another, we do to the source of life itself. And I realize in the nod is the answer. In the nod is the answer. It is the intergenerational passing the torch of walking the walk and talking the walk. Grandma had shown and taught her little granddaughter over and over again who we are to one another as souls on earth. Grandma had shown her little granddaughter the walk, and she knew without saying a word, and the nod was the passing of spiritual values. This is who we are. We share a language of the sacred. We treat nature as the little geese, as our relatives, all our relations. And we know that in our walk, every day we teach spiritual values. The last point is that of fellowship. There are two dimensions of awakened awareness that are game-changing on the rest of our life: our direct relationship to the transcendent and its presence in our love immanence of one another, radical love, unconditional love of neighbor. The child is made whole when both forms of relational spirituality are realized. And in the naturally spiritual child, the child is a knower. The child will ask, who is coming to dinner? Who is coming to Christmas dinner? Will everyone be there? Will Uncle John be there? Will Aunt Alice be there? When we are whole, the child feels whole. They will come home from school and say, today in circle in kindergarten, Angela, she was not there today. Apparently, Angela was sick. Now, when I miss work because I'm sick, I rather suspect that no one has noticed. Right? So there's a sense in which there is a wholeness, a completeness in the group. When we pave the road for the child, when we do these things for the young child, it is there as they go into the developmental passage of spiritual individuation of which we spoke. Suddenly, we are faced with a lot more than we were taught. We go off to college, we go into the public, we can drive cars, go new places. We have a Times Square, this is Times Square in New York, of options. And what we have taught the child to say is, what does your spiritual core say about this? That is the spiritual core, the unification of head and heart. And as we look around the world, we see, whether we're in India, Europe, China, the US, the naturally spiritual core has phenotypes, have forms of expression. Now, of course, there's rich variation. There's beautiful variation and diversity of faith traditions. But from the red brain, and it is also the case that from the red brain, there are core perceptions that are in and through all people. An on-ramp to transcendent awareness, prayer, meditation. The experience that of unitive reality, interconnectedness, the parietal, putting in and out hard boundaries. We are one. What we do here has everything to do what happens a mile away, 100 miles away. And love as a mutative force. Unitive love. Love is not like happiness. It's not just an emotion. It is a mutative force to love. An on-ramp, unitive love, an off-ramp, morality derived from our relationship to ultimate reality. We cannot just cherry pick based on hedonic morals. They are written into life itself. Those are 4 phenotypes. The 5th is the most powerful of the 5 phenotypes that we found in India, China, Europe, the US. All correlate with the red brain. But the one that correlates most broadly is love of neighbor, altruism. That we might, towards one another, always be loving, holding, guiding, and never leave anyone alone. The curative, sustaining power in AA, loving, holding, guiding. You can call your sponsor at 2 a.m. 2/3 of people to recover from AA do through spiritual awakening, half spontaneously, half by chipping away among the 2/3. Relational spirituality, and this is where the red brain welcomes all of us back into our birthright as spiritual beings. Because the very same awakened brain that is engaged by an evangelical orthodox is the very same awakened brain that is engaged by the humanist who says my ultimate relationship to reality is in my love and care of fellow humans. It is relational spirituality, born with it. And when it is realized, it is our greatest resource. Okay, so should we visit a little bit? Or do you want more science? How are we doing? The generals in the army say that all this science is like drinking from a fire hose.
Wow, you have really taken us through a scientific, spiritual, moral, uniting, warming journey, kindling, I think, and rekindling many flames, but also kindling the force to kindle. And kindling the force to carry the torch. We've gone a long way. Are you still open to one more question?
Please.
Yes. Come over here if you want.
So thank you in the first place. It's amazing. I just love it. I was wondering, because you tend to stress relational spirituality. So I'm assuming that when you're doing research, you're also sort of looking into what is there in terms of relation, like prayer, like exemplifying all those things. Do you really make that difference? Yeah.
Thank you. So it's beautiful. There's so much beautiful science to share, and much of it is in the awakened brain. So I don't panic that we only have 15 minutes, because much of it is. There is universal spirituality in all of us, and there is rich variability, rich diversity in its expression, the transcendent way in, the symbols. And Ken Wilber wrote beautifully about the different forms of relational spirituality that he had observed. Amongst Judeo-Christians in the West, there's often a dialogue. I turn to God and I feel an answer in my heart. I ask a prayer and I see in my intuition or mystical experience the response. A dialogue. And Wilber calls that the second person, the dialogue. In many of the rich Eastern traditions, Wilber calls it the first person. I am one with all existence. And very often teenagers will say, I'm walking through the parking lot, I see a single blade of grass, and suddenly I know all the universe is in that blade of grass. Unitive reality, oneness. We are part of in nature, I am aware that I am one with all creation. So we have the second person, the first person, and then in the many ancient indigenous traditions, for instance, in the United States, in Native Americans, spirit, God, Wananichi, is in the wind, is in crow, is in the sun, the third person. Whether we are in the first person oneness, second person dialogue, third person source through creation, tree, all are forms of relational spirituality. And no matter which way it's told, we use the same upstream awakened brain, the same neuro docking station, the same circuits. Eco-spirituality, theistic spirituality, communal spirituality, counsel. We are loved and held, we are guided, and we are never alone. The three go together, they entrain, they go together, and they're there whether the story told was in the first, second, or third person of a transcendent relationship. I find that beautiful. There's one spiritual brain and we all have it. So the first thing that we need to put a hard stop on is religious war, because it's completely wrong. It's ridiculous. There's one spiritual brain. The next thing is that your question, are there different ways in? There's many ways in. The rich diversity of culture through which the 2/3 embrace, through which we have a name and a symbol and a practice and a ceremony, rich ways in, the 2/3 embrace are enormously varied. And yet they all engage loved, held, guided, and never alone if they are confluent with this innate seat of spiritual awareness. I'm sometimes asked, hey, you know what? Someone will raise their hand and say, the way that I grew up, I was raised in a religion that in my neighborhood, the way that on my block that religion was interpreted and led by those particular human beings, it was not loving, holding, guiding. I actually was thrown out because I'm gay, or they wouldn't baptize my baby because I wasn't married. And it was a deep wound, right? They did not see the torchbearer walk the walk of the torch. Spiritual injury. And what the wise inner soul and all of us can connect with was that walk loving, holding, and guiding? Was it consistent with our deep gift of innate spiritual connection? And I have seen people find their way back directly to the torch through the type of practices that we shared and through you embodying loved, holding, guiding, and never leaving alone. The healing relationship in therapy is a foundationally spiritual relationship. And we can give that language. And it can, as we've seen, one neurodocking station be a pathway through which is ignited and opened the natural relational spirituality. From this love with you as your patient comes an opening, like Dr. Weaver's 28 sons of this love. Oh, one more study. A group from the Search Institute, authors including Benson was one of them, published in Positive Psychology, I believe 2000, about 10 years ago. They went around the world. They went to Thailand. They went to Ukraine well before the war. They went to Canada and UK. They went all around the world, and they saw that about half to 2/3 all around the world of adolescent spiritual emergence looked the same, maybe closer to 70%. I commend you to the article. Huge sample. Uganda, all over the world. There were all of the components that we've described in the surge, the booting up, a quest for ultimate meaning and purpose, a map of ultimate reality and who am I in it? And then service, actual giving, caring, walking the walk. What's very interesting is that the transcendent relationship was grappled with all around the world. This is who we are.
I find it very, very moving, the way you are able to give this a language in such a differentiated and such a clear and such a simple way at the same time. And I think this is going to do exactly what you've described at the beginning. You wanted to give us a tool, a lens, a means to, in a way, help ourselves and others. And I really feel that the language you're giving us, and also, with this beautiful evidence in the background, which we look forward to deepening more into in your book, is extremely helpful. Thank you so much for this contribution to our meeting here. You're still muted.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I do I have 3 minutes, or does everyone?
Yes, please. No, we just didn't want to take more of your time, but if you have more time for us, we're very happy. To share you're the last program of the day, and I think we're all happy to stay here a bit more with you.
I will be quick and succinct.
You don't need to be quick.
I do want to share something with you that when I leave it out, I'm always told you left that out. So I want to make sure. I want to make sure I share this. We've talked about the surge in emerging adulthood, and we've talked about the surge at midlife, right? And in my first book, The Spiritual Child, I emphasize this point. It's true again at midlife and as we cross the third bridge to elderhood. And I want to move into this, it'll be 3 minutes, by asking us to look at the upside, the relationship between the red brain and virtue, kindness, patience, gratitude, grit, resilience, the virtues that are both in and of themselves inherently valuable, and the virtues that give us good traction in the world, help us to make success in the sense that we pursue our vision. Okay. So I'd like to invite you to think about a young person who you have known who has lots of commitment and now grit, now optimism and kindness. How many people were you thinking of? You know, many wonderful young people. Most people say one, and this is why. The character strengths and virtues. Marty Seligman was my doctoral mentor 20 years ago when Marty Seligman was starting the positive psychology movement. And I love Marty Seligman as my mentor, but we never agreed on this point, and now we have the data to address it. From a radical materialist view, a public square without a spiritual core, an academia with only one ontology, latent radical materialism. The character strengths and virtues are the good ways that we live, right? From which maybe bubbles up a feeling of niceness. But actually what we see are two things, very important, and it's been replicated on hundreds of thousands of people at the VIA. The first, look along the x-axis, meaning, grit, optimism, gratitude, forgiveness. The character strengths and virtues cluster into the same people. This is 5,500 college students, organically occurring categories in blue, purple, green, and red using latent class analysis, the natural clustering of people. And it turns out there's a bunch of college students there in blue who are high in forgiveness and gratitude and optimism and grit and meaning. They are high across the board as compared to everyone else. These are parallel lines, blue, green, and red for now, 3 parallel lines. The green are in the middle and the red are low. And I can have in my clinical practice, my classroom, my family, a blue and a red. Character is a global trait. Virtue is a global trait. The preponderance of difference, of variance amongst people, is actually in a singular entity. Does this person have character? And for blue, green, and red, the extent to which I am low, medium, or high in character as a global trait is anchored on the left, daily spiritual awareness. And when we looked longitudinally at what predicts what, it was daily spiritual awareness. I turn to God for guidance. Nature is sacred. My friends have special spiritual significance. God walks with me. The forest is very much alive. I am part of the universe. Daily spiritual awareness goes hand in hand with the character strength, character, for 85% of 18 through 25-year-olds in this sample. The purple folks might be called virtuous humanists. They are high in character, forgiveness, gratitude, optimism, grit, and meaning, low in transcendent awareness in the way it was measured here, vertically. But they may well be high in it as measured horizontally. This was a vertical measure, higher power. Why is this the case? Why is character effectively spiritually rooted, spiritually embedded character? Here's the hard work of growing up with a spiritual core, without a spiritual core. Who am I? Well, who am I in a transactional public square? I am the best soccer player in my high school. Me? Actually, I was cut from the varsity team as a junior. I'm not an athlete. Who am I? I took all advanced science classes. I'm going to engineering school. Actually, I will not make it into college. I am my performance. Who am I? I am my abilities, my parts and pieces. In the United States, a study was done on the number one predictor of popularity in girls and popularity in boys in highly resourced high schools and communities with many resources. What might you imagine in the public square of the high school in a well-resourced community is the number one predictor of social esteem, the tidal wave, popularity in girls? Weight, parts and pieces. And number two is nastiness, to make someone popular. In boys, number one was substance abuse, and number two was conquest over girls. This is a very hard place to live. This is a place that is transactional. Well, right now in the United States, there is such a tendency to know myself only as parts and pieces.
Did I understand rightly? You were saying that, the number one things that made you popular at high school was
amongst affluent communities was weight
and nastiness.
Girls. And nastiness was number two. Mean girls, like the musical.
Making you popular.
To instantiate rank.
Awa. And in boys was?
Substance use. And number two, not intimacy, but conquest over girls.
This is in affluent, well-off areas. It's not out in the hardest parts of the Bronx.
Right. Exactly. And in fact, the lead scientist, Dr. Sunil Luther, of those studies, had gone into affluent communities thinking she was finding a control group for her devoted work in the inner city, but actually found that compared to the inner city, affluent communities had higher rates of depression, higher rates of addiction and anxiety. So even though the children had plenty of material support and parents who loved them, their inner life was more painful than the children in the inner city, many of whom had a strong religion and spiritual life. There is nothing as profoundly transformative of our lives, of our walk, than a strong spiritual core. And to take it even a step further, an abilities-based identity. Who am I? I am my 98. I am my varsity athlete. Outside of the number one high school, California, Palo Alto, where Stanford is high school, there was a cluster of suicides where children, after failure, would throw themselves in front of a train. So there's now a full-time security guard and a fence to prevent failure-driven suicide, the number one killer of youth. But how can we change that? And we can. Right now, the second, we can change it. Who am I? Because of how you talk to me. You, my parent, my counselor, my teacher. Who am I? Am I the number one at math? Well, I am, but that's not who I am. Mm-hmm. Am I cut from varsity as a junior? Yeah, but that's not who I am. Who am I? I am a soul on earth. I'm a child of God. I'm a being of infinite humanist worth. I am like a ray from the sun. What is it to be oh so smart? That is an endowment, a capacity, a gift through which I might carve my contribution and calling. A much more resilient, deep way of being, because the day comes where I graduate, I'm top 1%, I go to engineering school or medical school, and I'm bottom quarter. That's disappointing, but it is not existentially annihilating. It is noise on the trajectory of my bigger purpose, my sacred calling to connect people, clean the water. Last example, if I'm a soul on earth, you're a soul on earth. And our relationship is about encouragement and forgiveness. On a tough day, it is about deep forgiveness. You took my girlfriend, but I don't want to kill you, right? There is a net to catch us. It is my view that the threadbare civil society that plagues Gen Z in post-industrial culture is a direct emanation of the atrophy of the spiritual core, which means in this time of rapid growth and formation, we have an enormous opportunity to strengthen the spiritual core and reconnect people in civil society. That's what else I wanted to be sure to share with you today.